He thought stopping her would prove a point, but within seconds, he would wish he had never opened his mouth. The grand hall of the Westbridge Symphony glowed under warm golden chandeliers, their light reflecting off polished marble floors and rows of elegantly dressed patrons settling into velvet seats. The air thick with quiet anticipation and the faint rustle of silk and tailored suits, a place where reputations were made and broken in a single performance. And at the center of it all stood Adrian Blackwood, the maestro whose name alone could sell out a 2,000-seat auditorium in under an hour. His posture rigid with authority as he adjusted his cufflinks beside the gleaming Steinway grand piano, an instrument worth more than most homes, an instrument no one touched without permission, and certainly not someone like her. Lillian Hayes moved silently near the edge of the stage, her simple gray dress blending into the background, her presence barely acknowledged as she wiped a faint smudge from the piano's glossy surface, her movements careful, almost reverent, as though she understood something deeper about the instrument than anyone in that room. But to the watching eyes of the elite audience, she was invisible, just another staff member preparing the stage for greatness that belonged to someone else. Adrian noticed her only when her fingers lingered a second too long on the keys, a soft accidental note breaking the controlled silence of the hall, and his expression tightened instantly, his sharp gaze cutting across the stage like a blade as murmurs rippled faintly through the front rows, his voice low but carrying with unmistakable authority as he stepped forward. "That's enough. Step away from the piano." The words weren't shouted, but they landed heavy, drawing attention, turning heads, shifting the energy in the room as Lillian froze for just a moment, her hand still hovering over the keys before slowly retreating, her eyes steady, unreadable, and for a brief second, something in her calmness seemed out of place, like a note that didn't quite belong yet refused to resolve. Adrian exhaled sharply, dismissing it, turning to the audience with a faint, practiced smile, but the interruption had already planted a seed of curiosity, a subtle tension that lingered in the air, and as he glanced back at her, still standing quietly at the edge of the stage, he made a decision that felt harmless, almost amusing in the moment, a way to reassert control, to remind everyone of their place in this carefully ordered world. "Actually," he said, his tone shifting just enough to draw attention again, "since you seem so interested, why don't you play a few notes for us?" A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the audience, polite but unmistakable, the kind reserved for moments when someone was about to be gently put in their place, and all eyes turned to Lillian, expecting hesitation, embarrassment, an awkward retreat, but she didn't move right away, her gaze lowering briefly to the piano, her fingers flexing almost imperceptibly as if remembering something long forgotten. And in that suspended moment, the room seemed to hold its breath without knowing why. The faint hum of anticipation settling over the crowd as Adrian stepped back, confident, composed, completely unaware that he had just set something irreversible into motion, something that would not only silence the room, but redefine it. The laughter lingered just long enough to sting, a soft ripple moving through the hall like a breeze no one acknowledged but everyone felt. And yet Lillian Hayes did not react the way they expected. She did not lower her head in embarrassment or step back into the shadows where she had been invisible only moments ago. Instead, she stood still, her posture quiet but grounded, as if the weight of every gaze in that 2,000-seat auditorium had no power over her at all. And for a brief second, Adrian Blackwood narrowed his eyes, not in anger but in curiosity, because something about her stillness did not match the moment he had carefully orchestrated. But he dismissed it just as quickly, turning slightly toward the audience with the confidence of a man who had controlled every room he had ever entered, certain that what was about to happen would reinforce exactly what everyone already believed. "Go ahead," he said, gesturing lightly toward the piano, his voice carrying just enough amusement to keep the crowd engaged. "Let us hear what you have." The spotlight remained fixed on the grand piano, its polished surface reflecting the warm glow above as if waiting for a performance worthy of its reputation, and slowly, without any visible hesitation, Lillian stepped forward, her shoes making almost no sound against the stage, her movement unhurried, deliberate, each step measured in a way that felt strangely out of sync with the nervous energy building in the room. And somewhere in the back row, A man shifted in his seat, unsure why the air suddenly felt heavier than before. She reached the bench and paused, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge as though reacquainting herself with something familiar, something deeply personal. And then she sat, not like someone stepping into a role, but like someone returning to a place she had once belonged, her back straight, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steady, and for the first time since the moment began, the faintest flicker of uncertainty crossed Adrian's face, so subtle it would have been missed by anyone not watching him closely. The audience leaned forward almost collectively, expecting awkwardness, a missed note, something that would confirm the quiet judgment already forming in their minds. But Lillian did not rush. She did not fumble. She simply rested her hands above the keys, hovering for a fraction of a second, and in that suspended moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, the low hum of whispers fading into nothing, replaced by a silence that felt different now, no longer amused, no longer dismissive, but attentive, cautious, as if something unseen had shifted beneath the surface. Adrian folded his arms, watching, waiting for the inevitable misstep, his expression composed, but his focus sharper now, because despite everything, despite the setting, despite the certainty he carried into this moment, there was something about the way she sat at that piano that did not feel like a performance at all. It felt like inevitability, and when her fingers finally lowered toward the keys, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only a quiet, unspoken confidence that did not need to be announced. And somewhere deep in the room, before a single note had even been played, a realization began to form, faint and unsteady, that whatever was about to happen would not follow the script anyone had expected. The first note did not announce itself with force. It arrived quietly, almost too gently to command attention, yet it carried a clarity that cut through the air like light through glass, pure and deliberate. And in that instant something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, as if the room itself had taken a step back to listen more closely. And Lillian did not look at the audience. She did not look at Adrian. Her eyes remained on the keys, calm and focused, as her fingers moved again, this time forming a sequence so precise, so controlled, that it erased the last traces of amusement lingering in the hall. The second phrase followed with effortless continuity, each note placed with intention, not rushed, not hesitant, but exactly where it belonged. And a man in the third row who had been leaning back with casual indifference slowly straightened, his expression tightening as recognition flickered across his face, because this was not accidental, this was not luck, this was mastery, the kind that could not be faked, the kind that revealed itself within seconds to those who knew what to listen for. Adrian's posture changed almost imperceptibly, his folded arms loosening as his gaze fixed more intensely on her hands, his confidence still present but no longer unquestioned. Because the sound filling the hall was not what he had anticipated, it was not simple, it was not tentative, it carried structure, emotion, control, a depth that demanded respect whether one was willing to give it or not. And still, Lillian did not perform for them. She played as if the room had disappeared, as if the marble floors, the chandeliers, the audience of carefully dressed strangers had all faded into the background, leaving only the instrument and the story unfolding through her fingertips. The melody began to build, not louder but fuller, layers forming with quiet authority, drawing the listeners in without asking for their permission, and the whispers that had once lingered were gone now, replaced by a silence that felt different, heavier, more deliberate, the kind of silence that only exists when people realize they may have misjudged something important. A woman near the front pressed her lips together, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in criticism but in concentration, while another leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as if afraid to move and break whatever was happening on that stage. And somewhere in the back, a soft intake of breath echoed before disappearing into the stillness. Adrian took a single step closer without realizing it, his focus narrowing completely, the faint crease between his brows deepening as the realization he had resisted began to surface, because the control, the phrasing, the subtle shifts in dynamics were not just correct, they were exceptional, and exceptional was a word he did not use lightly. Lillian's hands moved with increasing confidence now, not faster, not more forceful, but more certain, as if each note confirmed something she had always known but never needed to prove, and the piano responded in kind, its sound filling the hall with a richness that seemed to grow with every passing second, until the boundaries between performer and instrument blurred into something seamless, something undeniable. No one laughed now, no one shifted in their seat, no one dared to interrupt, because the moment had outgrown them. It no longer belonged to their expectations or their judgments. It belonged entirely to the quiet woman at the piano, and as the melody reached a point where it could either falter or transcend, it did neither. It simply continued with a confidence so natural it felt inevitable, and in that inevitability, the truth settled over the room like a weight no one could ignore, that whatever they thought they were about to witness had already been replaced by something far greater, something they had not been prepared to understand, and certainly not prepared to dismiss. The melody did not simply continue. It expanded, unfolding with a quiet authority that no longer asked for attention but commanded it. Completely. Each phrase connecting seamlessly to the next as if the music had been waiting for this exact moment to exist, and Lillian's expression remained unchanged, calm, focused, untouched by the weight of the room that now belonged entirely to her, her fingers moving with a precision that felt both effortless and deliberate, every note placed with intention, every pause held just long enough to draw the listener deeper. And somewhere near the center aisle, a man who had spent decades attending performances at this very hall slowly lowered his program, his eyes fixed on the stage with a growing sense of disbelief, because what he was hearing was not just skill, it was interpretation, it was depth, it was something that could not be taught in any classroom or acquired through reputation alone. Adrian stood motionless now, no longer the figure of effortless control he had been moments earlier, his gaze locked onto the piano, as if searching for a flaw that refused to appear, his mind racing through possibilities, explanations, anything that could restore the balance he had assumed was unshakable. But the longer he listened, the more that balance slipped away, because the phrasing was intentional, the dynamics were nuanced, the emotional weight carried through each passage with a clarity that left no room for doubt, and doubt was something he was not accustomed to feeling in his own domain. The music swelled slightly, not in volume but in presence, filling every corner of the hall with a richness that seemed to resonate beyond the instrument itself, and the audience remained perfectly still, no shifting, no whispering, no movement at all, as if even the smallest sound might break whatever fragile, extraordinary moment was unfolding before them. And for the first time that evening, the distance between performer and audience disappeared completely, replaced by a shared awareness that something rare was happening, something that could not be recreated or predicted, only experienced. Lillian's hands moved with quiet confidence now, no trace of hesitation remaining, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, as though she had stepped into a space where judgment no longer existed, where expectation held no power. And in that space, the music spoke for her in a way words never could, revealing not just technical mastery, but something deeper, something lived, something earned over time in ways no one in that room had taken the time to understand. A woman in the front row felt her eyes well slightly, though she could not explain why, only that the sound carried a weight that reached beyond the surface, beyond the polished setting and the formal attire, touching something personal, something unspoken, and she was not alone, because across the hall, subtle shifts in expression told the same story. Curiosity replaced by respect, amusement replaced by quiet awe, the transformation complete and undeniable. Adrian took another small step forward without realizing it, his usual composure slipping just enough to reveal the truth beneath it, because this was no longer a moment he controlled, no longer a performance he could frame or interpret for others. It was something that existed entirely outside of him, and the realization settled in slowly, heavily, that he had misjudged not just her, but the very nature of what stood before him. The final sequence approached with a quiet inevitability, not rushed, not forced, but carried forward with a confidence that felt absolute. And as the last notes began to take shape, the tension in the room tightened, not from uncertainty, but from anticipation, because everyone understood now that they were witnessing something that would not be easily forgotten, something that would linger long after the sound itself had faded. And when the final note finally arrived, it did not crash or demand applause. It simply settled into the silence that followed, a silence so complete, so profound, that it said everything no one in that room could yet put into words. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. The final note still lingering in the air like a presence that refused to disappear, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, heavy with realization, stretching across the entire hall until it became impossible to ignore, and Lillian remained seated at the piano, her hands resting gently in her lap, her expression unchanged, as if what had just happened required no acknowledgement, no reaction, as if it had simply been inevitable all along. Then, somewhere near the back, a single pair of hands came together, the sound sharp against the stillness, followed by another, and then another, until the entire room erupted, applause rising in waves, not polite, not restrained, but genuine, overwhelming, the kind that could not be staged or manufactured. And yet, even as the audience stood, their admiration unmistakable, Lillian did not turn to face them. She did not bow. She did not seek their approval. She simply rose quietly from the bench, her movements as composed as they had been before the first note was ever played. Adrian Blackwood stood frozen just a few feet away, the applause washing over him without meaning, his focus locked entirely on her, his mind struggling to reconcile the reality before him with the assumptions he had carried into this moment, because nothing about this aligned with what he believed to be true, not her presence, not her performance, not the way the audience now looked at her with a respect that had not existed minutes earlier, and for the first time in years, perhaps longer, he found himself without words, without control, without certainty. As Lillian stepped away from the piano, the spotlight seemed to follow her instinctively, though she did not acknowledge it, her gaze steady, her pace unhurried, and as she passed him, Adrian opened his mouth as if to speak, to reclaim something of the authority he had lost, but no words came, only a faint tightening in his jaw as the realization settled deeper, heavier, that he had not just underestimated her. He had revealed something about himself that could not be undone. The audience continued to applaud, some exchanging glances filled with disbelief, others shaking their heads as if trying to process what they had just witnessed, and among them, those who understood music at its highest level recognized something even more profound, that what had just occurred was not merely a display of skill, but a moment of truth, one that exposed the difference between performance and presence, between reputation and reality. Lillian reached the edge of the stage and paused briefly, not to acknowledge the applause, but as if considering something unseen, and then, without hesitation, she stepped beyond the light, disappearing into the quiet shadows from which she had come, leaving behind a room forever changed by her absence as much as her presence. Adrian remained where he stood, the applause still echoing around him, yet it felt distant now, disconnected, as though it no longer belonged to him or the world he had built, and slowly, almost reluctantly, he turned back toward the piano, its polished surface reflecting the empty space where she had been, and for a brief moment, the weight of that emptiness said more than any sound ever could, because in that silence, stripped of illusion, the truth was unmistakable, that greatness does not ask for permission, and humility is the only thing that can recognize it when it appears. The applause continued long after she had disappeared from sight, filling the grand hall with a kind of energy that no one could quite release, as if letting it fade would mean accepting that the moment had already passed, and yet beneath the surface of that admiration, something deeper had taken root, something quieter and far more unsettling for those who had witnessed the beginning of it all. Adrian Blackwood stood alone near the piano, the same instrument that had once symbolized his authority now reflecting a truth he could not ignore, and for the first time in years, he did not step forward to reclaim the stage. He did not gesture for silence or acknowledgement. He simply stood there, his gaze fixed on the empty space where Lillian had been, replaying every second with a clarity that left no room for denial. The memory of his own voice, controlled and dismissive, echoed in his mind with a weight that grew heavier by the second, not because it had been loud, but because it had been certain, and certainty, he realized now, had been his greatest mistake. Around him, Members of the audience began to lower themselves back into their seats, their conversations returning in hushed tones, but their words were different now. No longer centered on expectation or prestige, but on what they had just witnessed, on the quiet woman who had stepped onto that stage without introduction and left without explanation, leaving behind a performance that none of them could fully define, only feel. A man near the front leaned toward his companion, speaking in a voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying an unmistakable reverence, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might somehow diminish the moment, while others simply sat in silence, their expressions thoughtful, reflective, as though something within them had shifted in a way they could not yet articulate. Adrian exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders releasing just enough to reveal the truth he had resisted, that the stage had never belonged to him in the way he believed, that control was never guaranteed, and that talent, real talent, did not seek validation from those who assumed authority over it. He turned slightly, his eyes scanning the edges of the stage as if expecting her to reappear, to offer some explanation that would restore balance. But there was nothing, only the soft glow of the stage lights and the lingering presence of what had already happened, unchangeable and complete. Somewhere beyond the curtain, faint movement suggested the quiet continuation of a world that did not pause for reflection, yet within that hall, time seemed to stretch just a little longer, allowing the weight of the moment to settle fully, to be understood not as an interruption, but as a revelation. And as Adrian finally stepped back from the piano, not with the confidence he once carried, but with a measured awareness of something new, something humbling, the truth followed him in silence, undeniable and lasting, that the greatest performances are not announced, they are revealed, and when they are, they leave behind more than applause. They leave behind a question that lingers far longer than the sound itself, a question about what is seen, what is assumed, and what is overlooked when judgment speaks before understanding has a chance to listen. The program was supposed to continue, the evening carefully scheduled down to the minute, each performance arranged to maintain a rhythm of prestige and expectation. Yet something in that rhythm had been disrupted in a way no one could immediately correct, and as the stage manager stepped hesitantly near the curtain, glancing toward Adrian for direction, there was a pause that stretched longer than it should have, a silence not of music this time, but of uncertainty. Adrian stood still for a moment longer, then finally straightened his posture, the familiar discipline returning to his movements, though something in his expression had changed, something quieter, more restrained, as if the certainty that once defined him had been replaced by a careful awareness he could not yet fully control. He turned toward the audience, offering a composed nod, a gesture that signaled continuation, yet the applause that followed was different now, less about him, less about the evening as planned, and more about what had already taken place, a subtle but undeniable shift in where the room's attention truly belonged. As the next performer was announced, a young pianist with impeccable credentials and years of formal training, the audience responded politely, but the energy had changed, their focus divided, their expectations no longer aligned with the predictable structure they had arrived for, because something real had already happened, something that could not be repeated or surpassed by design alone. The young performer took his place at the piano, his posture precise, his movements rehearsed, and when he began to play, the notes were technically flawless, each passage executed with discipline and control, yet there was a hesitation in the way the audience received it, not out of disrespect, but because comparison had already been drawn, silently and collectively, and it was a comparison no one had intended to make. Adrian watched from the side of the stage, his arms no longer folded, his stance less rigid, his gaze thoughtful rather than critical, and as the music continued, he found himself listening differently, not for mistakes, not for superiority, but for something deeper, something that he now understood could not be manufactured through technique alone. The performance concluded to respectful applause, yet the room did not rise as it had before, the reaction measured, contained, as if everyone understood that what they had just heard, while impressive, did not carry the same weight, the same presence that had filled the hall moments earlier. Backstage, quiet conversations began to form, whispers passing between staff members and performers alike, questions unspoken but clearly felt, who she was, where she had come from, How someone like her could possess that level of mastery without recognition, without introduction, and yet no one had answers, only fragments of observation, small details that now seemed significant in hindsight. Adrian remained near the curtain, his attention drifting toward the corridor where Lillian had disappeared, a part of him expecting that she might still be there, waiting, lingering, but the space remained empty, undisturbed, as if she had never been part of the evening at all, except for the undeniable truth left behind in the minds of everyone who had witnessed her. And in that realization, something settled within him, not as a conclusion, but as a beginning, a quiet understanding that the world he had navigated so confidently was far less defined than he believed, that talent did not always arrive with credentials or recognition, and that sometimes the most important moment in a room is the one no one planned for, the one that reveals more in a few seconds than years of certainty ever could. By the time the final piece of the evening concluded, the applause felt more like an obligation than a celebration, a polite acknowledgement of effort rather than a genuine response to something deeply felt. And as the audience began to rise from their seats, gathering coats and exchanging quiet words, the earlier moments still lingered beneath every conversation, unspoken yet impossible to ignore. Adrian remained near the side of the stage for a few seconds longer, watching the slow movement of people filing out of the hall, their expressions thoughtful, their voices lower than usual, as if the experience had shifted something internal that demanded reflection rather than immediate reaction. And then, without announcing his intention, he turned and stepped away from the spotlight, moving toward the corridor behind the curtain where Lillian had disappeared. The backstage area carried a different energy now, less polished, more practical, filled with the soft hum of staff resetting equipment and performers quietly packing their belongings. Yet even here, fragments of conversation carried her presence, a technician pausing mid-task to ask if anyone knew her name, a stagehand recalling how naturally she had approached the piano, each detail building a quiet narrative that none of them could fully explain. Adrian walked past them without interruption, his focus fixed on the narrow hallway that led away from the stage, his steps measured, deliberate, not hurried, yet driven by something he could not dismiss, a need not for confrontation, but for understanding. He reached the end of the corridor where a side exit opened into the cool night air, the faint sound of traffic from the street beyond filtering in, and for a moment he paused, his hand resting lightly against the doorframe, as if uncertain whether to continue, because what waited outside was no longer a performance, no longer a controlled environment, but something real, something unscripted. When he finally stepped through, the contrast was immediate, the quiet of the night replacing the structured acoustics of the hall, the city stretching out in soft lights and distant movement, and there, just a few steps away beneath a dim street lamp, stood Lillian, her figure simple against the backdrop of passing cars and muted conversations, as if she had always belonged more to this space than the stage she had just transformed. She was not waiting in the way one expects to be approached. There was no anticipation in her posture, no sign that she expected recognition or acknowledgement. She simply stood there, her gaze calm, her presence unchanged, as though the performance had not altered her in the slightest. Adrian slowed his steps as he approached, the distance between them closing not with urgency, but with a quiet awareness, and when he finally stopped a few feet away, the silence that followed was different from the one inside the hall, less charged, more honest, and for the first time that evening, he spoke without authority, without performance, his voice carrying none of the sharpness it once had, only a simple question that held more weight than any command he had given before. "Who are you?" Lillian looked at him for a brief moment, her expression steady, not guarded, not proud, simply present, and then she gave the smallest hint of a smile, not one of triumph or validation, but of understanding, as if the question itself revealed everything that needed to be said. And in that quiet exchange, the distance between assumption and truth became clear in a way no audience, no applause, and no performance ever could. Adrian's question lingered in the cool night air, simple in its wording yet heavy with everything it carried, and Lillian did not answer right away, not because she was hesitant, but because the answer itself did not require urgency. It did not demand explanation in the way he expected, and for a moment, The faint hum of the city filled the silence between them, distant headlights passing, footsteps echoing along the sidewalk, the world continuing as if nothing extraordinary had just taken place. She finally looked at him fully, her eyes steady, clear, not seeking approval, not holding resentment, only a quiet certainty that seemed untouched by the events inside the hall. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, measured, almost gentle. Someone who learned a long time ago that being seen is not the same as being understood. The words settled between them without force, yet Adrian felt them more deeply than anything he had heard that evening. Because they did not challenge him, they revealed something he had overlooked not just in her, but in the way he had approached his entire world. He searched her expression, as if expecting more, a name, a title, a history that would allow him to categorize her, to place her within the structure he understood, but she offered none of it, only that quiet presence that had never needed recognition to exist. "You should have been on that stage," he said after a moment, his voice softer now, stripped of its earlier authority, and for the first time, it carried something close to humility, a recognition that came too late to change what had already happened, but not too late to be acknowledged. Lillian's slight smile returned, not in agreement, not in disagreement, but in understanding, as if the statement itself was beside the point, and she shook her head almost imperceptibly, her gaze drifting briefly toward the distant glow of the hall behind him. "That stage was never the goal," she replied quietly, and there was no bitterness in her tone, no regret, only a simple truth that did not need elaboration. Adrian followed her gaze, looking back at the building that had defined so much of his life, its lights still shining, its doors still open to those who believed they belonged there. And for the first time, he saw it differently, not as a place of certainty, but as a place limited by its own assumptions. When he turned back, Lillian had already begun to step away, her movement as quiet and unremarkable as it had been when she first appeared, and instinctively, he took a small step forward, as if to stop her, to ask something more, but the words did not come, because there was nothing left to ask that would change what he now understood. She paused only briefly before continuing down the sidewalk, her figure blending into the ordinary rhythm of the city, passing unnoticed by those who had not been there, by those who would never know what had just occurred. And in that quiet departure, there was no need for recognition, no need for applause, because the moment had already fulfilled its purpose. Adrian remained where he stood, the night air cool against his skin, the echo of the performance still present in a way that no sound could replicate, and slowly, the realization settled fully, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet certainty that would remain long after the evening faded. That true mastery does not seek attention, it does not demand acknowledgement, it simply exists, waiting for those willing to see beyond what is presented, and in that understanding, the world around him felt just slightly different, not louder, not brighter, but clearer, as if something essential had finally come into focus. And as he turned back toward the hall, no longer with the same confidence, but with something far more grounded, the truth followed him in silence, undeniable and lasting, that respect is not granted by status. It is earned through the humility to recognize greatness when it appears, even in the places no one thinks to look.